The morning sun filtered through the dusty windows of petals and peace, casting gentle shadows across rows of carefully arranged flowers. Helen Martinez moved quietly between the displays, adjusting white roses here, straightening yellow daisies there. Her movements were precise, economical, like someone who had learned long ago that wasted motion could cost lives. To the people of Millbrook, she was simply the quiet woman who had opened the flower shop 3 years ago. She knew everyone's names, remembered their favorite arrangements, and never spoke louder than necessary. When Mrs. Patterson came in for her weekly bouquet, Helen would have the pink carnations ready before the elderly woman finished climbing the front steps. When young couples needed wedding flowers, Helen designed arrangements that made them cry with joy, but she never stayed for the ceremonies. "Morning, Helen," called Deputy Sheriff Tom Bradley as he passed the shop window. Helen raised her hand in a small wave but didn't smile. She rarely smiled, though her eyes held a warmth that made people feel welcome despite her reserve. The shop was small but immaculate. Every stem cut at perfect angles, every vase polished until it gleamed. The cash register was an old mechanical model that required exact change, which Helen seemed to calculate in her head faster than most people could use a calculator. Behind the counter, a small radio played classical music at low volume. No personal photos decorated the workspace, no certificates hung on the walls. Just flowers, tools, and the faint scent of earth that seemed to follow Helen wherever she went. Helen had chosen this location carefully when she first arrived in Millbrook. The shop sat on the corner of Main Street and Elm, providing clear sightlines in all directions. The apartment above offered a perfect vantage point of the entire downtown area. These weren't conscious security considerations anymore, just habits ingrained by decades of training she preferred not to remember. The building itself was over a century old, with thick brick walls and solid hardwood floors that didn't creak under footsteps. Helen had spent the first month after purchasing it making subtle modifications, reinforcing the locks, installing a security system that looked standard but featured military-grade components, and ensuring that every window offered both visibility and quick exit routes. At precisely noon, Helen flipped the open sign to closed and walked to the small apartment above the shop. She ate lunch alone, always the same meal: black coffee, a sandwich, and an apple. Through her window, she could see the entire main street of Millbrook, from the diner on the corner to the library at the far end. She watched without really watching, a habit she couldn't break. The view encompassed everything important in the small town: the sheriff's office, the fire station, the school, and the church. Helen knew the daily routines of most residents, not from curiosity, but from the automatic situational awareness that had kept her alive in less peaceful places. She knew that Mrs. Chen walked her dog at exactly 3 o'clock every afternoon, that the mail carrier always stopped for coffee at the diner around 10:30, and that teenagers gathered behind the library after school to share cigarettes they thought adults couldn't see. Most afternoons brought a steady stream of customers: teachers buying flowers for retirement parties, teenagers nervously selecting prom corsages, and always someone dealing with loss. Helen handled each interaction with the same quiet competence. She asked only necessary questions, offered gentle suggestions, and somehow always knew exactly what people needed, even when they didn't know themselves. "You have a gift," Mrs. Patterson had told her once. "These flowers, they seem to understand what we're feeling." Helen had simply nodded and wrapped the bouquet in brown paper, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. She didn't mention that she had learned to read people's needs in places where misunderstanding could mean death. She didn't explain that her steady hands had once performed more crucial tasks than arranging flowers. The people of Millbrook appreciated Helen's quiet presence, but they never asked personal questions. She volunteered no information about her past, her family, or why a woman who couldn't be older than 45 had chosen to spend her days among flowers in a town where nothing much ever happened. Some customers tried to draw her out. "Where did you learn to arrange flowers like this?" they would ask. Helen would answer simply, "Practice," and continue working. When people commented on her unusual strength, she could lift heavy planters without assistance and never seemed to tire during long days, she would just shrug and change the subject. Young Danny Morrison, who delivered supplies from the wholesale market, had once commented on her technique. "You move those buckets like they're empty," he said, watching Helen effortlessly position a container that held 40 pounds of water and flowers. "Leverage," Helen had replied, demonstrating how to lift with her legs instead of her back. She didn't mention that she had once carried unconscious soldiers across mountain terrain for miles without stopping. The truth was that Helen Martinez had spent 22 years in the United States Air Force, specializing in pararescue operations. She had jumped from aircraft into hostile territories, climbed mountains to reach stranded soldiers, and performed medical procedures under enemy fire. The precision that now went into arranging flowers had once been used to save lives in the most dangerous places on Earth. Her service record, filed away in secured databases she hoped would never be accessed, told a story of extraordinary courage and skill. 347 successful rescue operations across 4 continents. 17 decorations for valor, including recommendations for the highest honors the military could bestow. She had pulled pilots from burning aircraft, carried wounded soldiers through enemy-controlled territory, and coordinated complex evacuations under conditions that would have broken most people. But that was before she decided that she had seen enough, done enough, lost enough, before she chose silence over stories, flowers over fanfare. The people of Millbrook didn't need to know that their quiet florist could read weather patterns like a book, navigate by stars, or carry a 200-pound man for miles without stopping. The transition from military service to civilian life had been harder than any mission she had ever undertaken. For months after her retirement, Helen had drifted from city to city, unable to settle anywhere that felt like home. She had tried working in hospitals, where her medical training might be useful, but the sterile environments reminded her too much of field hospitals in war zones. She had considered becoming a paramedic or firefighter, but those careers would have kept her too close to the adrenaline and danger she was trying to leave behind. The idea of working with flowers had come to her in a Veterans Administration counseling session. The therapist had suggested finding something beautiful to focus on, something that grew instead of something that could be destroyed. Helen had dismissed the idea at first, but weeks later she found herself in a garden center, drawn to the simple miracle of plants that thrived with nothing more than water, soil, and sunlight. She had studied floriculture with the same intensity she had once applied to tactical medicine and survival techniques. She learned about soil composition, growth cycles, pest management, and the subtle art of arranging living things in ways that pleased the eye and lifted the spirit. For the first time in decades, she was learning skills that created beauty instead of preventing destruction. Helen preferred it that way. In her shop, surrounded by beauty that grew from earth instead of destruction, she had found something she had never experienced during her military career: peace. The afternoon of her 3rd anniversary in Millbrook had been typical until old Mr. Peterson failed to return from his daily walk. His daughter Sarah came to the flower shop, not for flowers, but because everyone in Millbrook knew that Helen was the person you talked to when you needed someone to listen. "He always comes home by 4, Sarah said, wringing her hands. "Never later than 4. It's past 6 now." Helen set down the lily she had been trimming and gave Sarah her full attention. This was another skill from her former life: the ability to focus completely on the person in front of her, to read not just their words, but their body language, their fear, their unspoken concerns. Where does he usually walk? Helen asked, her voice carrying a calm authority that Sarah found reassuring. The old trail behind the cemetery. He's been taking the same route for 15 years, ever since Mom died. But with his memory problems lately. Sarah's voice trailed off. Helen had noticed Mr. Peterson's increasing confusion over the past few months. He had come into the shop several times asking for flowers for his wife, forgetting that she had passed away years ago. Helen had always gently helped him choose a small bouquet and watched as he carried it to the cemetery, sometimes following at a discreet distance to make sure he arrived safely. The memory issues were becoming more pronounced. Last week, Mr. Peterson had become confused in the grocery store, unable to remember what he had come to buy. The week before, Mrs. Chen had found him sitting on a park bench at midnight, uncertain how he had gotten there or how to get home. "Have you called the sheriff's office?" Helen asked. "Deputy Bradley is organizing a search, but they're short-handed. It'll be dark soon, and Mr. Peterson doesn't see well anymore. If he's wandered off the trail..." Sarah didn't finish the sentence. Through the shop window, Helen could see people gathering near the town hall. Volunteers with flashlights, the volunteer fire department preparing their equipment, several members of the church congregation. Good people, well-meaning people. But Helen could see from their body language that they had no real plan. She watched Deputy Bradley attempting to organize the volunteers, his good intentions hampered by lack of training in search and rescue procedures. The groups he was forming were too large, too loud, and they were planning to search too close to town. If Mr. Peterson had been wandering for hours, he would be much farther out by now. Helen could see other problems with their approach. They were starting their search at the wrong time. Dusk was the most dangerous period for a lost person, when visibility decreased rapidly and temperatures began to drop. They had no systematic grid pattern, no communication protocols, and no one with experience reading terrain and predicting where a confused elderly person might go. "I'm sure they'll find him," Helen said quietly, but she was already calculating distances, terrain, and time factors in her mind. The trail behind the cemetery led into several hundred acres of mixed forest. If an elderly man with dementia had wandered off the path, he could be anywhere. Sarah left to join the search effort, and Helen watched through her window as the volunteers organized themselves into groups. The scene reminded her of the chaos she had often witnessed when well-meaning but untrained personnel attempted complex operations. In the military, she had learned that good intentions without proper training and coordination often led to additional casualties. Deputy Bradley was doing his best to coordinate, but Helen could see the problems immediately. The groups were too large, making too much noise, and they were starting their search pattern too close to town. They were calling Mr. Peterson's name loudly, which might actually drive a confused elderly person further away if he perceived the voices as threatening. Helen knew from experience that people with dementia often exhibited specific patterns when they became lost. They typically followed paths of least resistance, were drawn to water sources or shelter, and often moved towards something that felt familiar, even if that familiarity was based on memories from decades past. She also knew that the window for a successful search was closing rapidly. Mr. Peterson had been missing for at least 4 hours, was wearing only light clothing, and would soon face a cold autumn night. Hypothermia could set in quickly for someone his age, and disorientation would only increase his risk of injury. Helen closed her shop and climbed the stairs to her apartment. In the back of her bedroom closet, behind winter coats and old dresses, sat a metal footlocker she hadn't opened in 3 years. The combination came to her fingers automatically. The date of her last mission. The footlocker was a relic from another life, but one she had been unable to throw away. Sometimes late at night, when the memories were particularly vivid, she would sit beside it and remember the weight of the equipment it contained, the missions it had accompanied her on, the lives it had helped her save. Inside the locker, wrapped in waterproof material, were items she had never expected to need again. A GPS unit more advanced than anything available to civilians, a tactical flashlight with multiple settings for different visibility conditions, a first aid kit designed for wilderness emergencies, and a pair of boots that had carried her through jungles, deserts, and mountains. At the bottom of the locker lay something else, a small radio capable of reaching emergency frequencies. Helen changed into dark pants and a moisture-wicking shirt designed to regulate body temperature in various weather conditions. She laced up the boots that still fit perfectly, their familiar weight bringing back muscle memory from thousands of miles of difficult terrain. She clipped the equipment to her belt with practiced efficiency, checking each item to ensure it was secure and accessible. Looking in the mirror, she saw a different person than the one who arranged flowers. The soft lines of her face had hardened into focus. Her posture had straightened into military bearing. Her hands moved with the unconscious precision of someone preparing for a mission where every detail could mean the difference between success and failure. She was no longer Helen the Florist. She was Master Sergeant Helen Martinez, pararescue specialist, and she had a mission. Before leaving her apartment, Helen took a moment to study a topographical map of the area that she kept in her desk drawer. She had purchased it shortly after moving to Millbrook, telling herself it was for hiking, but really because old habits died hard. The map showed elevation changes, water sources, old logging roads, and terrain features that might attract or impede a lost person. The main trail behind the cemetery forked in several directions, leading to different areas of the forest. Most of the search teams would focus on the most obvious paths, but Helen knew that confused individuals often made choices that seemed random to others, but followed some internal logic. She traced possible routes with her finger, considering factors the volunteers wouldn't think about: prevailing wind direction, natural sound barriers, and the psychological tendency for lost people to move downhill toward water sources or uphill toward what seemed like safety. Helen also considered Mr. Peterson's personal history. He had lived in Millbrook his entire life, had probably explored these woods as a child. In his confused state, he might be following routes he remembered from decades ago, paths that had since become overgrown or redirected. The search teams were making too much noise. Helen could hear them from half a mile away, calling Mr. Peterson's name and crashing through underbrush. Their good intentions were undermining their effectiveness, creating a disturbance that could easily frighten an already confused elderly man. Helen moved parallel to their position, but much farther out, using trails and animal paths they didn't know existed. Her military training had taught her to move through any terrain silently, to read the landscape for signs of passage, and to think like the people she was trying to find. She activated her GPS unit and began marking waypoints, creating a systematic search pattern that would ensure she didn't waste time covering the same ground twice. Every few hundred yards, she paused to listen, straining to hear sounds that didn't belong to the forest: human voices, movement through brush, or calls for help. 22 years of training had taught her to think like the people she was trying to find. Mr. Peterson was elderly, confused, and probably scared. He wouldn't respond to loud calls from strangers, especially voices he didn't recognize. He would seek shelter, water, or something familiar. Helen studied the terrain with eyes that had learned to read landscape like a map. The forest was a mixture of old growth and newer sections where logging had occurred decades earlier. The older areas offered thick canopy cover, but clearer movement at ground level. The newer growth was denser, but provided more shelter and concealment. A frightened, confused person might be drawn to either environment for different reasons. Helen checked her watch and calculated how far Mr. Peterson could have traveled in the time he had been missing. An elderly man with mobility issues would move slowly, but determination and confusion could drive someone to cover surprising distances. She expanded her search radius accordingly. The main trail forked in 3 directions about 2 miles from town. The search teams had assumed Mr. Peterson would take the most obvious path, but Helen knew better. People with dementia often chose routes that seemed random, but actually followed some internal logic based on decades-old memories or subconscious navigation cues. Helen took the narrowest fork, the one that led toward an old logging road. Her boots made no sound on the forest floor as she moved, scanning for signs that the volunteers had missed. Broken branches at the right height, disturbed leaves, the faint impressions of footprints in soft earth. The old logging road had been abandoned for 20 years, but it still provided an easier path through the forest than the overgrown hiking trails. Someone seeking familiar territory might be drawn to what had once been a main thoroughfare through these woods, even if they couldn't consciously remember when or why they had traveled it before. 3 miles from the main trail, she found what she was looking for: a clear boot print in mud beside a small stream. The size and tread pattern matched the shoes Mr. Peterson had been wearing when he left for his walk. The print pointed north, toward a section of forest that would be completely dark within the hour. Helen activated her GPS and marked the location, then continued tracking. Every few hundred yards, she found more signs. A thread of fabric caught on a thorn, more footprints, a candy wrapper that Mr. Peterson must have dropped. He was moving steadily, but slowly, and he was heading uphill toward an area of steep ravines. The evidence painted a clear picture of Mr. Peterson's journey. He had left the main trail early, probably drawn by some half-remembered familiarity with the logging road. He was moving with purpose, not wandering aimlessly, which suggested his confusion was following some internal map that made sense to him, even if it was based on outdated information. The temperature was dropping, and Helen knew that hypothermia would become a factor soon. Mr. Peterson was wearing only a light jacket, and the forest floor would be cold and damp. She increased her pace, following the trail with growing urgency. Helen's training had included extensive instruction in wilderness survival and the physiological effects of exposure. She knew that elderly individuals were particularly vulnerable to rapid temperature changes, that confusion and disorientation increased dramatically when the body's core temperature began to drop, and that the combination of physical exertion and fear could accelerate the onset of hypothermia. At the top of a ridge, Helen paused to listen. In the distance, she could still hear the search teams, but they were moving in the wrong direction. Her radio crackled with their communications, reports of negative contact and requests for additional volunteers. They were organized and dedicated, but they were looking in all the wrong places. The radio chatter confirmed what Helen had observed earlier. The search was being conducted by well-meaning amateurs who lacked the training and experience necessary for an effective operation. They were working harder, not smarter, exhausting themselves and their resources, while the actual trail grew colder with each passing hour. Helen continued north, following a faint deer path that showed recent human disturbance. The trees were thicker here, blocking most of the remaining daylight. She switched on her tactical flashlight, using it sparingly to preserve night vision while still being able to follow the trail. The tracks were becoming more erratic now, suggesting that Mr. Peterson was tiring and possibly becoming more confused. His footprints showed signs of stumbling, longer pauses between steps, and small deviations that indicated he was having trouble maintaining his chosen direction. 20 minutes later, she heard it. A faint voice calling for help. The sound came from below her position, somewhere in the ravine system that cut through this part of the forest. Helen immediately switched off her flashlight and listened intently, waiting for the voice to come again so she could establish an accurate bearing. Helen moved toward the sound, careful not to make noise that might frighten a confused elderly man. The techniques came automatically. Test each footstep, avoid loose rocks and dry branches, move slowly enough to maintain perfect balance. In hostile territories, the ability to move silently had often meant the difference between successful rescue and additional casualties. The voice came again, weaker now, from somewhere below her position. She was at the edge of a steep slope that dropped into a narrow ravine. The terrain was treacherous even in daylight, with loose rocks, hidden roots, and unstable soil that could give way without warning. "Hello?" she called softly. "Mr. Peterson?" "Down here," came the reply. "I'm hurt. I can't get up." Helen secured her flashlight and began descending the slope, using roots and rocks for handholds. The techniques came back automatically. Test each grip. Maintain 3 points of contact. Control the descent. These were skills she had used in mountain rescues, cliff evacuations, and countless training exercises designed to prepare pararescue personnel for any terrain. The slope was approximately 40 feet of steep, unstable ground covered with loose rocks and fallen branches. In daylight, with proper equipment, it would have been a challenging but manageable descent. In near darkness, with an injured person waiting at the bottom, it required every bit of skill and experience Helen possessed. At the bottom of the ravine, her light found Mr. Peterson sitting against a fallen log, his right ankle bent at an unnatural angle. He was conscious and alert, which was encouraging, but his lips showed the blue tinge that indicated the early stages of hypothermia. "Thank God," he said when he saw her. "I've been here for hours. I fell, and I can't walk." Helen knelt beside him and began a quick medical assessment. The techniques came automatically. Check for head injuries, assess breathing and circulation, evaluate the extent of trauma. Possible ankle fracture, mild hypothermia, dehydration, but conscious and alert. She had seen much worse under much more difficult conditions. "You're going to be fine, Mr. Peterson," she said, her voice calm and professional. "My name is Helen. I'm going to get you out of here." The reassurance wasn't just words, it was a promise backed by decades of experience in exactly these kinds of situations. Helen had performed medical evaluations and emergency treatment in combat zones, natural disasters, and remote wilderness areas. A broken ankle in a forest ravine was challenging but well within her capabilities. She wrapped him in the emergency blanket from her kit and gave him water from her bottle. The emergency blanket was a space-age material designed to reflect body heat and provide insulation in extreme conditions. Helen made sure it covered Mr. Peterson completely, creating a barrier between his body and the cold ground. Then she activated her radio and contacted the search teams. "This is Helen Martinez," she said. "I have Mr. Peterson. He's injured but stable. I need an evacuation team at my GPS coordinates." The radio exploded with voices. Deputy Bradley's voice cut through the chatter. "Helen? Where are you?" Helen gave her precise coordinates and began describing the best route for the rescue team to reach them. Her instructions were clear, detailed, and delivered with the authority of someone who had coordinated much more complex operations. "Turn north at the old logging road junction," she said. "Follow the deer path for approximately 1 mile until you reach the ridgeline. Look for my flashlight signal. The descent into the ravine will require ropes and someone with climbing experience." "That's impossible," she heard someone say over the radio. "That's almost 5 miles from where we've been searching." "She's right," came another voice. "I'm looking at the map. That's exactly where she says." While they waited for the rescue team, Helen splinted Mr. Peterson's ankle and monitored his condition. She used materials from her first aid kit and improvised supports from branches to create a temporary but effective stabilization of the fracture. The splint would prevent further injury during the evacuation and reduce Mr. Peterson's pain significantly. He was lucid now, warmed by the emergency blanket and grateful for company. The combination of warmth, hydration, and human contact had improved his condition noticeably. though Helen continued to monitor him for signs that his condition might deteriorate. "You found me in the dark," he said wonderingly. "How did you know where to look?" Helen adjusted the splint and checked his pulse. "Sometimes you have to think like the person you're looking for," she said simply. "Are you a nurse? A doctor?" "I arrange flowers," Helen replied, which was technically true, though it wasn't the complete truth. The answer satisfied Mr. Peterson, who was too tired and relieved to pursue the conversation further. Helen continued her medical monitoring while listening to the radio chatter as the rescue team organized their approach. It took the rescue team 45 minutes to reach them, even with Helen's detailed directions. When they arrived, led by Deputy Bradley and 3 volunteer firefighters, they found Helen calmly monitoring Mr. Peterson's vital signs and keeping him warm. The rescue team had brought proper equipment: climbing ropes, a rescue basket, and additional medical supplies. But they immediately recognized that Helen had already performed the most critical interventions. Mr. Peterson was stable, comfortable, and ready for transport. "My God, Helen," Bradley said as they prepared to carry Mr. Peterson out on a stretcher. "How did you find him?" "We've been searching for hours." Helen helped secure the straps on the stretcher, her movements betraying familiarity with evacuation procedures. "I got lucky," she said, but Bradley had seen the efficient way she had handled the medical care, the professional quality of her radio communications, and the precise manner in which she had guided them to the location. This wasn't luck. This was expertise. "Where did you learn to do this?" he asked as they began the careful ascent out of the ravine. Helen didn't answer immediately. She was focused on making sure the stretcher remained stable as they navigated the steep terrain. Only when they reached level ground did she speak. "You pick things up," she said. The next morning, Millbrook was buzzing with news of the rescue. Mr. Peterson was in the hospital with a broken ankle, but otherwise fine. The story spread quickly through the small town. Helen the florist had somehow found him in the dark when organized search teams could not. People began looking at Helen differently. When she opened her flower shop that morning, customers lingered longer, asking questions she politely deflected. Mrs. Patterson brought her a homemade pie. The mayor stopped by to personally thank her. A reporter from the county newspaper wanted to do a story. Helen handled the attention the same way she handled everything else: quietly, efficiently, and with minimal comment. She accepted thanks graciously, but offered no details about how she had located Mr. Peterson so quickly. When people pressed for information, she simply said she was glad he was safe and changed the subject to flowers. The reporter, a young woman named Jennifer Walsh from the Millbrook Gazette, was particularly persistent. She had covered enough local stories to recognize when something didn't add up, and Helen's rescue of Mr. Peterson had all the hallmarks of professional search and rescue work. "How did you know to look so far from the main search area?" Walsh asked, notepad ready. "Sometimes you have to think outside the box," Helen replied, continuing to arrange a funeral spray without looking up. "But you found him in complete darkness, in terrain that even the volunteer firefighters described as dangerous. That suggests specialized training." Helen finally looked at the reporter directly. "Are you buying flowers today, or conducting an interview?" Walsh recognized the polite dismissal and left without a story, but her curiosity was far from satisfied. She began making phone calls to contacts in emergency services, asking about Helen Martinez, and wondering if anyone knew where a small-town florist might have acquired such obviously professional skills. But the questions didn't stop. Over the next few days, more people noticed things they had previously overlooked. Helen's perfect posture, her habit of scanning rooms when she entered them, the way she moved with unconscious precision, the fact that she never seemed startled by sudden noises and always knew who was approaching her shop before they entered. Deputy Bradley was particularly curious. He had 20 years of law enforcement experience, and he recognized professional training when he saw it. Helen's radio technique, her medical knowledge, her ability to navigate in difficult terrain, these weren't skills acquired through casual hiking or first aid classes. Bradley began paying closer attention to Helen's behavior, not out of suspicion, but out of professional respect. He noticed that she always positioned herself with a clear view of exits, that she unconsciously evaluated everyone who entered her shop, and that she moved with the efficient economy of motion he had seen in military personnel. During his coffee breaks, Bradley found himself stopping by the flower shop more frequently, ostensibly to chat, but really to observe. Helen was unfailingly polite, but never volunteered information about herself. She deflected personal questions with such skill that people often didn't realize they had learned nothing about her. "Have you lived in Millbrook long?" someone might ask. "Long enough to know that Mrs. Patterson prefers pink carnations," Helen would reply, effectively ending that line of inquiry while demonstrating her attention to customer preferences. A week after the rescue, Bradley was having coffee at the diner when a man in a military uniform entered. The stranger was clearly not from Millbrook, and he was clearly looking for someone specific. He approached Bradley's table with the confidence of someone accustomed to asking direct questions and receiving direct answers. "Excuse me, deputy." "I'm looking for someone who might be in this area," the man said, showing Bradley a photograph. Bradley looked at the photograph and felt his suspicions crystallize. The woman in the picture was younger, wearing military fatigues and standing next to a helicopter, but it was unmistakably Helen. The uniform bore the distinctive patches of Air Force Special Operations, and the background showed the kind of rugged terrain that suggested deployment in a combat zone. "Who's asking?" Bradley said carefully. The man extended his hand. "Colonel James Webb, Air Force Special Operations Command. That's Master Sergeant Helen Martinez. She saved my life in Afghanistan 12 years ago." Bradley set down his coffee cup, his mind racing. "Master Sergeant?" "Pararescue," Webb said. 22 years of service. More successful rescue operations than anyone in the history of the program. She disappeared 3 years ago after she retired. No forwarding address, no contact information. I've been trying to find her ever since." "Why?" Bradley asked, though he was beginning to understand. Webb's expression grew serious. "Because she's being awarded the Air Force Cross for her final mission. The ceremony was supposed to happen years ago, but she vanished before anyone could present it to her. I finally tracked her here after I heard about the old man she found in the forest. The technique, the efficiency, it had her signature all over it." Bradley thought about Helen's quiet presence in the community, her reluctance to discuss her past, her obvious desire for privacy. What if she doesn't want to be found? "Then I'll respect that," Webb said. "But first, I need to thank her properly. And I need to tell her that she's not forgotten." Bradley considered the implications of Webb's revelation. Helen wasn't just a former soldier. She was a decorated hero who had chosen anonymity over recognition. The fact that she had saved Mr. Peterson using skills acquired in military service suddenly made perfect sense. "There's something else you should know," Bradley said. "The rescue last week wasn't a fluke. She found that man using techniques that none of our volunteers could have managed. Professional-level search and rescue, medical treatment, communication protocols. Now I understand why." Webb nodded. "Helen never did anything halfway. If she found your missing person, it's because she brought everything she learned in 22 years of service to bear on the problem. That's how she operated in the military, and apparently, that's how she operates as a civilian." That afternoon, Webb walked into Petals and Peace. Helen was arranging white lilies, her movements as precise as always. She looked up when the bell chimed, and for just a moment, her composed expression faltered. The recognition was instantaneous and mutual. Webb saw the woman who had pulled him from a crashed helicopter under enemy fire, who had carried him to safety despite her own injuries, who had refused all recognition for her actions. Helen saw the young captain she had saved, now older and bearing the rank of colonel, but still alive because of decisions she had made in a few crucial minutes years ago. "Hello, Helen," Webb said quietly. "Or should I say, Master Sergeant Martinez?" Helen set down the lily she was holding and looked directly at him. For the first time since she had opened the shop, someone in Millbrook saw her military bearing clearly visible. "Colonel Webb," she said, "you're a long way from Colorado Springs." Webb looked around the flower shop, taking in the peaceful atmosphere, the careful arrangements, the obvious pride Helen took in her work. The contrast with the harsh environments where he had known her could hardly have been more stark. "I've been looking for you for 3 years," he said. "You missed your decoration ceremony." Helen's face showed no emotion. "I didn't miss it. I chose not to attend." "The Air Force Cross, Helen, for the Kandahar operation. You pulled 8 men out of that valley under direct fire. You carried me for 6 miles with a dislocated shoulder." The memory was as clear to Helen as if it had happened yesterday. The helicopter had gone down in a valley controlled by enemy forces, 8 crew members scattered across rocky terrain under constant sniper fire. The extraction was supposed to be simple. Get in, get the survivors, get out. But nothing about that day had been simple. Helen had jumped from the rescue aircraft into a landing zone that was immediately compromised. Enemy fire had disabled their communications and separated the rescue team. She had found Webb first, unconscious and bleeding from a head wound, then located the other survivors one by one while moving under enemy observation. The evacuation had taken 14 hours instead of the planned 2. Helen had carried wounded men across miles of hostile territory, performed emergency medical procedures without proper equipment, and coordinated their rescue while injured herself. By the time they reached friendly forces, she had been running on pure determination for hours. "I did my job," Helen said simply. Webb knew better than to argue with her assessment, but he also knew that what Helen had accomplished that day went far beyond the call of duty. The official after-action report had described her performance as extraordinary beyond the bounds of normal heroism. But Helen had disappeared before anyone could properly recognize her actions. "Is this what you wanted? This quiet life?" Webb asked, gesturing toward the flowers that surrounded them. Helen considered the question for a long moment. Through the shop window, she could see Mrs. Patterson walking slowly down the sidewalk, probably coming in for her weekly flowers. In a few hours, the after-school crowd would arrive, teenagers buying single roses for first dates and school dances. Tomorrow would bring its own small dramas and simple joys. "Yes," she said finally. "This is exactly what I wanted." Webb nodded slowly. "The ceremony is next month at the Pentagon. The Chief of Staff wants to present the medal personally. There will be media, speeches, recognition for everything you've accomplished." Helen shook her head. "I don't need recognition, Colonel. I needed peace. I found it here." "What about the people who served with you? What about the families of the men you saved? They want to honor you properly." "They can honor me by living good lives," Helen said, "by taking care of each other, by remembering what we fought for instead of how we fought." Webb reached into his jacket and pulled out a small wooden box. "This belongs to you, regardless of ceremonies or speeches." He placed the box on the counter between them. Helen stared at it for a long moment, then slowly opened it. Inside, nestled in blue velvet, was the Air Force Cross, a bronze cross with silver wings, attached to a blue and white ribbon. The medal was beautiful in its simplicity, but Helen felt none of the pride or satisfaction she might have expected. Instead, She felt the weight of all the missions that had led to this moment, all the people who hadn't made it home, all the decisions that had seemed so clear in the moment but carried such lasting consequences. 22 years of service, Webb said softly. Hundreds of lives saved. You earned this with blood and courage, Helen. It doesn't matter if you wear it or not. It's yours. Helen touched the metal lightly with one finger, then closed the box. Thank you for bringing it, she said. But my answer hasn't changed. No ceremony, no publicity. I'm Helen the Florist now. That's all I want to be. Webb studied her face for a moment, then nodded. I understand. But there's something else you should know. The story of the old man you found last week, it's spread beyond this town. Other veterans have heard about it. They're starting to piece things together. As if summoned by his words, the shop door chimed again. A woman in her 50s entered, wearing a Veterans Administration jacket. She looked directly at Helen with the expression of someone who had been searching for a long time. Master Sergeant Martinez, she said. My name is Linda Chen. You pulled my brother out of a crashed helicopter in Iraq in 2009. I've been looking for you for years, just to say thank you. Helen's composure remained intact, but something shifted in her eyes. The careful barriers she had built around her civilian life were beginning to crack, not from external pressure, but from the simple human need for connection with people who understood what she had experienced. Behind Linda, more people were approaching the shop. Through the window, Helen could see Deputy Bradley, Mrs. Patterson, and several other familiar faces from the community. Word was spreading with the efficiency that characterized all information in small towns. Word travels fast in a small town, Webb said gently, especially when people start asking the right questions. The door opened again, and this time it was Mr. Peterson himself, walking with a cane but moving steadily. Behind him came his daughter Sarah, both of them wearing expressions of deep gratitude mixed with newfound understanding. Helen, Mr. Peterson said, his voice stronger than it had been in the forest. I wanted to thank you properly. Sarah told me what you did, how you found me when no one else could. Helen looked around the shop, which was now filled with people who knew her in different ways. The townspeople who had accepted her as a quiet florist, the colonel who remembered her as a decorated soldier, the woman whose brother she had saved, and the man whose life she had preserved just days ago. For 3 years, she had maintained the careful separation between her past and present. But standing there, surrounded by the connections she had tried to avoid, Helen realized something important. She could choose peace without erasing history. She could value silence without denying service. There's something you all should know, Helen said quietly. The shop fell silent, everyone leaning in to hear. For 22 years, I served in the Air Force. I was a pararescue specialist. My job was to find people who were lost and bring them home safely. She paused, looking at each face in turn. When I retired, I thought I was done with that life. I wanted to create beauty instead of witnessing destruction. I wanted to grow things instead of searching through wreckage. Helen picked up the lily she had been arranging when Webb arrived. But last week, when Mr. Peterson was missing, I realized something. Rescue isn't about military operations or decorations. It's about using whatever skills you have to help people when they need it most. She looked at Linda Chen. I remember your brother. His name was Michael, and he had a picture of his daughter in his helmet. I'm glad he made it home to his family. Linda wiped tears from her eyes. He did. He walked me down the aisle at my wedding last year. He talks about you sometimes, about the woman who wouldn't leave him behind when everyone else said the situation was hopeless. Helen felt something loosening in her chest, a tension she had carried for years without realizing it. For so long, She had focused on forgetting the difficult parts of her service, that she had also pushed away the knowledge of the good she had done, the lives that had continued because of her actions. She turned to Mr. Peterson. "And I'm glad you're safe, sir. Your daughter loves you very much." Mr. Peterson smiled. "She does indeed. And now I understand why you knew exactly how to find me. You've been finding lost people for a lot longer than any of us realized." "What about the medal?" Webb asked. "Will you accept it now?" Helen considered the question, then picked up the wooden box from the counter. For the first time since Webb had arrived, she looked directly at the medal inside, really seeing it not as a symbol of a past she wanted to escape, but as recognition of service that had meaning. "I'll accept it," she said, "but not for me. For everyone who never made it home. For the families who waited and worried. For the people in this town who remind me every day that service doesn't end when you take off the uniform." She opened the box and lifted out the Air Force Cross. Instead of pinning it to her shirt, she placed it carefully in the shop's display window, next to an arrangement of red, white, and blue flowers. "This is where it belongs," she said. "Not hidden away, but not the center of attention either. Just part of the community, like the rest of us." Mrs. Patterson stepped forward and touched Helen's arm gently. "Dear," she said, "we're proud to have you here, however you got here." The elderly woman's words carried the weight of the entire community's acceptance. Helen realized that her neighbors didn't care about her military decorations or her heroic past. They cared about the person she was in their daily lives, the woman who remembered their preferences, who listened to their concerns, who had risked her safety to find one of their own. Deputy Bradley nodded in agreement. "The town council wants to know if you'd consider consulting on our emergency response procedures. We could use someone with your expertise." Helen smiled, the first real smile anyone in Millbrook had seen from her. "I'd be honored to help," she said, "but I'm still keeping the flower shop." The response drew chuckles from the crowd, but Helen's commitment was serious. She had found her balance here, between the skills of her past and the peace of her present. She could share her knowledge without returning to the intensity of military life. As the crowd began to disperse, each person stopping to thank Helen personally, Webb lingered behind. "You found your peace," he said, "but you didn't lose your purpose." Helen looked around her shop, at the flowers she had arranged, the medal in the window, and the community that had embraced her. "No," she said, "I just found a different way to serve." Linda Chen was the last to leave, and she handed Helen a photograph before departing. It showed her brother Michael at his daughter's graduation, healthy and smiling, wearing his army uniform with pride. On the back, someone had written, "Thanks to Master Sergeant Martinez, I was here for this day." Helen studied the photograph for a long moment, then placed it on the shelf behind her counter where she could see it while she worked. It was a reminder that her service had created lasting value, that the difficult decisions and dangerous missions had resulted in moments like this, ordinary family celebrations made possible by extraordinary sacrifices. Over the following weeks, life in Millbrook settled into a new normal. Helen continued running her flower shop, but now people understood the full depth of her capabilities. The revelation of her military background had changed how people saw her, but it hadn't changed who she was in their daily lives. She began teaching wilderness first aid classes at the community center, sharing knowledge that could save lives without dwelling on the circumstances where she had acquired it. The classes were popular with hikers, hunters, and anyone who spent time outdoors, but Helen focused on practical skills rather than war stories. "The most important thing in any emergency," she would tell her students, "is to stay calm and think systematically. Panic kills more people than injuries do." She consulted with the volunteer fire department on search and rescue techniques, helping them develop protocols for finding lost hikers and missing persons. Her knowledge of terrain analysis, tracking, and human behavior patterns significantly improved their capabilities. Helen also helped train local emergency responders in navigation and survival skills. She taught them how to read topographical maps, how to use GPS units effectively, and how to move through difficult terrain safely. The training was conducted in the same forests where she had found Mr. Peterson, giving the volunteers practical experience in their own area. The medal remained in the shop window, and occasionally visitors would ask about it. Helen would tell them briefly about military service and the importance of bringing people home safely, but she always steered the conversation back to flowers, to the beauty of growing things, to the simple pleasure of creating arrangements that brightened people's days. Some afternoons, when the shop was quiet, Helen would look at the medal and remember the faces of the people she had saved over the years. Not with sadness or regret, but with quiet satisfaction. She had chosen a different path, but the skills and values that had made her an exceptional soldier continued to serve her community in ways that mattered. The people of Millbrook learned to see Helen in full dimension, not just as the quiet florist or the decorated veteran, but as someone who had found a way to integrate service and peace, duty, and contentment. She proved that heroes don't always need recognition, but they do need community. They need places where their skills matter and people who understand that strength comes in many forms. Deputy Bradley stopped by the shop regularly, not just for flowers, but for conversation. He had begun to understand that Helen's presence in Millbrook was itself a form of service, that her willingness to use her skills when needed made the entire community safer. "You know," he said one afternoon while Helen arranged flowers for the police station's memorial service, "before you came here, we would have lost Mr. Peterson. Our search methods just weren't sophisticated enough." Helen continued working, but she listened. "You would have found him eventually," she said. "Good people don't give up." "Maybe," Bradley said, "but probably too late. What you did that night saved his life, and what you're teaching us now will help us save others." Helen nodded, accepting the truth of his words. She was beginning to understand that her choice to retire hadn't ended her service. It had transformed it. Instead of rescuing people from war zones, she was helping a community become more capable of taking care of itself. The flower shop became an unofficial community center where people felt comfortable discussing problems and seeking advice. Helen's combination of practical wisdom and genuine care made her a natural counselor, though she never claimed that role explicitly. When young people were struggling with decisions about military service, they often found their way to Helen's shop. She would listen to their concerns and answer their questions honestly, sharing both the satisfaction and the costs of military life without trying to influence their choices. "Service means different things to different people," she would tell them. "The important thing is to serve something larger than yourself, whether that's your country, your community, or your family." A month after Webb's visit, Helen received a package with no return address. Inside was a scrapbook filled with photographs and letters from people she had rescued during her military career. Families sharing graduation pictures, wedding photos, birth announcements, all the life events that had been made possible by her actions. One letter particularly moved her. It was from the widow of a pilot she had been unable to save during a mission in Syria. Instead of blame or anger, the letter expressed gratitude for Helen's efforts and understanding that not every mission could end in success. "Thank you for trying," the woman had written. "Thank you for not giving up, even when the situation was hopeless. Knowing that someone like you was there, that someone cared enough to risk everything, gives me peace." Helen kept the scrapbook in her apartment, looking through it occasionally when she needed to remember why her service had mattered. The photographs showed ordinary people living extraordinary lives, families intact because of split-second decisions made in dangerous places by people they would never meet. 6 months after the rescue of Mr. Peterson, Helen's life in Millbrook had found a sustainable rhythm. She had integrated her past with her present in a way that honored both without compromising either. The flower shop remained her primary focus, but her additional roles as teacher and consultant gave her ways to serve that felt meaningful without being overwhelming. One morning, while Helen was preparing arrangements for a wedding, Deputy Bradley rushed into the shop with an urgency she hadn't seen since the night Mr. Peterson went missing. "Helen," he said, slightly out of breath, "we have a situation. A small plane went down in the state forest about 10 miles north of here. 2 people on board, including a child. The official search and rescue team won't arrive for hours, and weather conditions are deteriorating." Helen set down the roses she had been trimming. "What kind of plane?" "Small Cessna. Lost radio contact about an hour ago. Last known position puts it somewhere in the wilderness area beyond the old logging roads." Helen was already calculating factors: terrain, weather patterns, crash dynamics, survival probabilities. The wilderness area Bradley mentioned was remote and rugged, accessible only on foot or by specialized vehicles. If people were injured and conditions were worsening, time would be critical. "How many people do you have available?" she asked. 6 volunteers from the fire department, plus myself. We have basic first aid supplies and communication equipment, but—" Bradley paused, knowing he didn't need to finish the sentence. "But you need someone who knows how to find crashed aircraft and extract survivors," Helen completed. Bradley nodded. "Will you help us?" Helen looked around her shop, at the wedding flowers that needed to be finished, at the peaceful routine she had built for herself. Then she thought about a child somewhere in the forest, possibly injured, definitely scared, waiting for help that might not arrive in time. "Give me 10 minutes, she said. Helen closed the shop and climbed to her apartment, where the footlocker still sat in her bedroom closet. This time, she opened it without hesitation, pulling out equipment she hoped she would never need again, but was grateful to have available. She changed into field clothes, laced up her boots, and gathered medical supplies designed for trauma situations. The GPS unit, tactical flashlight, and emergency radio went into her pack along with items the civilian rescue team probably wouldn't have. Specialized tools for accessing crashed aircraft, medical equipment for treating severe injuries, and communication devices capable of reaching military emergency frequencies. When she came back downstairs, Helen was no longer the quiet florist. She was Master Sergeant Martinez, equipped and ready for a mission that would test every skill she had acquired in 22 years of service. The rescue team was assembled outside the sheriff's office. 6 volunteers with good intentions but limited experience, basic equipment, and no real plan for finding a crashed aircraft in difficult terrain. Helen quickly assessed their capabilities and began organizing them into an effective operation. "We'll work in teams of 2, she told them. "Communication checks every 15 minutes. No one goes out of radio range. If you find the crash site, don't approach until everyone is in position." She spread a topographical map on the hood of Bradley's vehicle and began marking search areas based on the plane's last known position, probable flight path, and most likely crash scenarios. Small aircraft in engine failure typically try to reach open areas for emergency landings, she explained. But in this terrain, they might have been forced down in forest. We'll search clearings first, then move to areas where a plane might have come down through trees. The volunteers listened with the attention of people who suddenly understood they were receiving instruction from someone who knew exactly what she was talking about. Helen's confidence and expertise transformed them from a group of well-meaning amateurs into a focused rescue team. They hiked into the wilderness area using techniques Helen had taught the fire department during their training sessions. Efficient movement through difficult terrain, systematic search patterns, and constant communication. Helen coordinated their efforts while covering the most challenging search area herself. 2 hours into the search, her radio crackled with a transmission from one of the teams. "We've got visual on the aircraft. Small Cessna, nose down in a clearing about half a mile from Deer Creek. No sign of movement." Helen immediately directed all teams to converge on the location, while she moved ahead to assess the situation. The crashed plane had come down hard, its nose buried in soft earth, one wing torn away by impact with trees. But the passenger compartment appeared intact, which was encouraging. As she approached the wreck, Helen could hear voices from inside, weak but definitely human. She established radio contact with Bradley and began coordinating the rescue operation. "2 survivors, both conscious," she reported. "Adult female with possible head trauma, child approximately 8 years old with unknown injuries. Aircraft is stable, but could shift if we're not careful." The extraction required everything Helen had learned about aircraft rescue operations. The door was jammed, the fuselage was twisted, and both survivors were trapped by debris. Working with careful precision, Helen and the volunteer team managed to free both passengers without causing additional injuries. The woman, who turned out to be the child's mother, had a concussion and several broken ribs, but was lucid and responsive. The child had a broken arm and was terrified, but otherwise unharmed. Helen performed emergency medical treatment while coordinating helicopter evacuation with the state police. "You're going to be fine," she told the little girl while splinting her arm. "We're going to get you to a hospital where doctors can fix you up completely." The child, whose name was Emma, looked up at Helen with the trust that children reserve for adults who radiate competence and calm. "Are you a doctor?" she asked. "No," Helen said, carefully adjusting the splint. "I arrange flowers, but I learned some other things along the way." The helicopter evacuation went smoothly, with both survivors transported to a trauma center where they made full recoveries. The rescue operation had taken 6 hours from initial notification to final extraction, conducted entirely by local volunteers under Helen's coordination. That evening, as Helen cleaned her equipment and returned it to the footlocker, she reflected on the day's events. The rescue had required every skill she possessed: technical knowledge of aircraft crashes, medical training for trauma situations, leadership abilities to coordinate multiple teams, and the physical conditioning to work effectively in challenging conditions. But it had also required something else: the willingness to step back into a role she had tried to leave behind. For 6 hours, she had been a pararescue specialist again, making life and death decisions, coordinating complex operations, and taking responsibility for outcomes that mattered profoundly. The next morning brought reporters, photographers, and television crews. The story of a small-town florist who led a volunteer rescue team to save crash victims had captured regional attention, and now national media wanted to know more about Helen Martinez. Helen handled the attention with the same quiet competence she applied to everything else, answering questions politely but briefly, deflecting attempts to sensationalize her story, and consistently redirecting credit to the volunteer team that had actually performed the rescue. "I just helped coordinate," she told the reporters. The real heroes were the people who dropped everything to spend 6 hours hiking through difficult terrain because strangers needed help. But the media had done their research. Helen's military record, while classified in many details, contained enough public information to construct a compelling narrative. Decorated Air Force pararescue specialist retires to small town, saves missing elderly man, then leads civilian rescue team to save plane crash victims. A week later, Helen received a phone call from the governor's office. The state wanted to recognize her civilian rescue efforts with a public service award. The ceremony would include officials from both civilian and military agencies, media coverage, and formal recognition of her contributions to emergency response capabilities. Helen politely declined. "I understand the desire to recognize good work," she told the governor's aide. "But the people who deserve recognition are the volunteers who responded without hesitation when their neighbors needed help. Focus on them." The refusal puzzled officials who were accustomed to people seeking recognition for much smaller accomplishments. But Helen's priorities were clear. She wanted to serve, not to be celebrated for serving. Deputy Bradley, who had become something of an unofficial liaison between Helen and the various agencies that wanted to work with her, understood her position better than most. "You know," he told her one afternoon, "some people are going to see your refusal of recognition as false modesty." Helen considered his observation while arranging funeral flowers for Mrs. Patterson's elderly brother. "Maybe," she said. "But I learned a long time ago that the moment you start serving for recognition instead of serving for purpose, you've lost something important." "What about inspiring others? Your example could encourage more people to develop emergency response skills." "Then let them be inspired by the volunteers who spent their weekend in the forest helping strangers," Helen said. "That's inspiration that translates into action." Bradley nodded, understanding her perspective. Helen's approach to service was fundamentally different from the recognition-driven model that characterized much of modern life. She believed that good work should be its own reward, and that public recognition often created distractions from the actual work. As autumn turned to winter, Helen expanded her teaching responsibilities. The airplane rescue had demonstrated the value of her knowledge, and community organizations began requesting specialized training sessions. Helen agreed to teach, but always with the condition that her instruction focus on practical skills rather than her personal experiences. She developed a comprehensive wilderness first aid curriculum that covered everything from basic wound care to complex trauma management. Her classes were hands-on, scenario-based, and designed to prepare ordinary citizens to handle emergencies effectively. "In any emergency situation," she would tell her students, "your most important tool is a calm, thinking mind. Everything else is just equipment and technique." Helen's teaching style was patient but demanding. She expected her students to master fundamental skills before moving on to advanced techniques, and she insisted on realistic training scenarios that would prepare them for actual emergencies. One Saturday morning, she was conducting a search and rescue workshop when a familiar figure appeared at the edge of the training area. Colonel Webb had returned to Millbrook, this time in civilian clothes and carrying a duffel bag. "I heard you were running a training program," he said when the class took a break. "Mind if I observe?" Helen looked at her former colleague with surprise. "You're a long way from Colorado Springs again, Colonel." "Actually, I'm not Colonel Webb anymore," he said. "I retired last month, and I was wondering if you might need an assistant instructor." Helen studied Webb's face, recognizing the expression of someone who was struggling with the transition from military to civilian life. She remembered the disorientation, the sense of purposelessness, the difficulty of finding meaning in activities that seemed trivial compared to life-and-death military operations. "What kind of experience do you have with civilian emergency response?" she asked. Webb smiled. 22 years of military experience and a strong recommendation from someone whose judgment I trust completely." Helen considered the offer. Her classes were becoming popular, and she was getting requests for advanced training that would benefit from additional expertise. More importantly, she recognized in Webb the same need for purposeful service that had driven her own choices. "Can you start next weekend?" she asked. Webb's relief was visible. "Absolutely." Over the following months, Helen and Webb developed the most comprehensive civilian emergency response training program in the region. Their combined expertise covered everything from basic first aid to complex rescue operations, and their classes attracted students from multiple states. But they maintained strict boundaries around their military experiences, focusing entirely on civilian applications of their knowledge. They taught people how to be more prepared, more capable, and more helpful to their communities without glorifying war or dwelling on combat experiences. The skills we're teaching you, Helen would tell new students, are about preserving life and helping people in crisis. How we learn these skills matters less than how you'll use them to help others. The flower shop remained Helen's primary identity and source of income, but it had evolved into something more than a business. People came there not just for flowers, but for conversation, advice, and the subtle reassurance that came from being around someone who radiated competence and calm. Helen had become an unofficial community resource, the person people called when they faced problems that required both practical skills and sound judgment. She helped elderly residents install safety equipment in their homes, taught teenagers basic survival skills before camping trips, and provided consultation for community emergency planning. But she also continued to create beautiful floral arrangements, to remember customers' preferences, and to provide the simple pleasure of fresh flowers for life's celebrations and sorrows. The balance between her various roles felt natural and sustainable. One spring morning, as Helen was preparing arrangements for the high school prom, Emma, the little girl from the plane crash, came into the shop with her mother. Emma's arm had healed completely, leaving only a small scar that she wore as a badge of honor. "I wanted to thank you again," Emma's mother said, "and to give you this." She handed Helen a drawing that Emma had made, a picture of a woman in a flower shop, surrounded by colorful blooms, with a medal visible in the window. At the bottom, Emma had written, "Thank you for taking care of people." Helen accepted the drawing with the same seriousness she would have given a formal commendation. "This is beautiful, Emma. Thank you." "Are you really going to hang it up?" Emma asked. Helen looked around her shop, at the professional displays and carefully arranged inventory. Then she walked to the wall behind her counter and hung Emma's drawing next to the photograph of Linda Chen's brother. "Right there," she said, "where I can see it every day." As Emma and her mother left the shop, Helen reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. She had begun her military career wanting to serve her country, had transitioned to civilian life wanting to find peace, and had ended up serving her community in ways she never could have imagined. The medal in her window caught the morning light, its bronze and silver gleaming among the flowers. It no longer represented a burden or a reminder of a past she wanted to escape. Instead, it had become a symbol of continuity, a bridge between who she had been and who she was becoming. Mrs. Patterson entered the shop, moving more slowly than usual, but still determined to maintain her weekly tradition. "The usual, dear?" Helen asked, already reaching for pink carnations. "Actually," Mrs. Patterson said, "I was wondering if you might help me with something else. My granddaughter is getting married next month, and I want to learn how to arrange flowers myself. Could you teach me?" Helen smiled. "I'd be happy to. When would you like to start?" As she began explaining the basics of floral design to Mrs. Patterson, Helen realized that teaching had become as natural to her as breathing. Whether she was showing someone how to treat a wound, how to read a topographical map, or how to arrange flowers, the fundamental process was the same: sharing knowledge that would help people create something valuable. 2 years after Webb's arrival in Millbrook, their emergency response training program had become a model for rural communities across the country. They had trained hundreds of volunteers, consulted on emergency planning for dozens of towns, and quietly built a network of capable, confident citizens who could respond effectively to crises. But their most important accomplishment was less tangible. They had demonstrated that military skills could be transformed into civilian service, that veterans could find purpose and meaning in peaceful applications of their training, and that small communities could develop remarkable capabilities when properly prepared. Helen's own integration was complete. She was no longer a former soldier trying to forget her past or a civilian trying to hide her capabilities. She was simply Helen Martinez, florist, teacher, community member, and someone who used all of her skills in service of the people around her. The shop remained her anchor, the place where she could create beauty and provide simple pleasure to her neighbors. But her other roles, teacher, consultant, emergency responder, had become equally important parts of her identity. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, as Helen arranged flowers for the town's Memorial Day ceremony, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had served her country in war zones around the world, had saved hundreds of lives in the most dangerous circumstances imaginable, and had earned recognition at the highest levels of military service. But she had also learned to find satisfaction in smaller victories, teaching a teenager how to read a compass, helping an elderly man find his way home, showing a grandmother how to arrange flowers for her granddaughter's wedding. These accomplishments might not merit medals or ceremonies, but they created lasting value in the lives of people who mattered. The memorial service would honor veterans from all of America's wars, including several from Millbrook who had never returned home. Helen's flower arrangements would provide beauty and dignity for the ceremony, just as her military service had helped ensure that such ceremonies could take place in freedom and peace. As she worked, Helen thought about the different forms that service could take. Some people served in uniforms, others in classrooms, still others in shops and offices where they provided goods and services that made life better for their communities. The important thing wasn't the form of service, but the commitment to something larger than oneself. Webb entered the shop carrying coffee for both of them, a routine they had developed during their partnership. He looked at the memorial arrangements Helen was creating and nodded with appreciation. "Those are beautiful," he said. "The families will appreciate them." "I hope so," Helen replied. "It's a small way to honor what their loved ones gave." Webb set down the coffee and studied Helen's face. "Do you ever regret leaving the military?" Helen considered the question seriously. "I regret some of the things I had to do and some of the people we couldn't save. But I don't regret the choice to serve, and I don't regret the choice to find a different way to serve. Even though your impact is smaller now, less dramatic." Helen gestured toward the medal in her window, then toward Emma's drawing hanging on the wall. "I'm not sure my impact is smaller. It's different. When I was pulling people out of helicopter crashes in Afghanistan, I was saving lives one at a time. Here, I'm teaching people skills that might save dozens of lives over the years. Which has more impact?" Webb nodded, understanding her perspective. "And you're happier?" "I'm at peace," Helen said, "and that's something I never expected to find." 5 years after her arrival in Millbrook, Helen Martinez had become as much a part of the town's identity as the library, the diner, or the church. Visitors often commented on the unusual combination of the flower shop with its medal in the window, the emergency response training center in the old warehouse district, and the quiet woman who somehow connected these disparate elements into a coherent whole. The training program she and Webb had developed had evolved into a nonprofit organization that provided emergency response education throughout the region. Their students had gone on to save lives, prevent disasters, and build more resilient communities in dozens of towns and cities. Helen's flower shop remained profitable and popular, but it had also become something of a pilgrimage site for veterans seeking examples of successful transition to civilian life. She welcomed these visitors without fanfare, offering practical advice and living proof that military skills could find meaningful application in peaceful contexts. The medal in her window had been joined by other recognitions. A photograph from the governor thanking Helen for her emergency response training, a certificate from the Red Cross acknowledging her contributions to disaster preparedness, and a letter from the mother of a child whose life had been saved by one of Helen's students. But the most meaningful addition was a small plaque placed there by the people of Millbrook themselves. It read simply, "In appreciation of service that continues," and it was signed by every family in town. Helen had never sought recognition, but she had learned to accept gratitude gracefully. She understood that people needed heroes, needed examples of service and sacrifice that gave meaning to their own struggles and choices. If her story could inspire others to serve their communities, to develop useful skills, or to find peace after conflict, then perhaps the recognition served a purpose beyond personal validation. On the anniversary of Mr. Peterson's rescue, the event that had first revealed Helen's true capabilities to the community, the town held a small celebration. Not for Helen specifically, but for all the volunteers who had participated in emergency responses over the past 5 years. Helen provided flower arrangements for the event, while Webb coordinated a demonstration of search and rescue techniques. Mr. Peterson, now fully recovered and serving as an advocate for elderly safety programs, spoke about the importance of community preparedness. "5 years ago," he told the crowd, "I got lost in the woods and learned something important about this town. We don't leave people behind. We take care of each other. And we're prepared to help when help is needed." Helen listened from the back of the crowd, appreciating Mr. Peterson's words, but thinking about the broader truth they represented. Communities were only as strong as their weakest members, only as capable as their least prepared citizens. Real security came not from walls or weapons, but from knowledge, skills, and the willingness to help one another. As the celebration wound down, Helen returned to her shop to prepare for the next day's orders. Wedding season was approaching, which meant long hours and complex arrangements. But it also meant joy, beauty, and the privilege of participating in life's most meaningful moments. She looked at the medal in her window, catching the evening light as it had for years now. It no longer represented a burden or a past she wanted to escape. Instead, it had become a symbol of continuity, connecting her years of military service with her ongoing civilian contributions. Helen Martinez had learned that service was not a phase of life, but a way of life. Not a uniform, but an attitude. Not a job, but a calling. She had found her place in a small town that appreciated both her capabilities and her humanity. And she had discovered that peace was not the absence of purpose, but the integration of all her purposes into a coherent, satisfying whole. The flower shop that bloomed in silence had become something neither purely military nor purely civilian, but uniquely valuable. A place where the skills of war had been transformed into the tools of peace, where a decorated soldier had become a beloved neighbor, and where service continued in forms both visible and invisible, recognized and unrecognized, dramatic and quietly essential. As Helen locked the shop and climbed the stairs to her apartment, she carried with her the satisfaction of another day spent in service to something larger than herself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to help, new flowers to arrange, and new students to teach. But tonight, she would rest in the knowledge that she had found her place in the world, a place where her past informed her present without defining it, where her skills served life instead of death, and where silence had indeed bloomed into something beautiful and lasting. The morning sun would filter through the dusty windows of Petals and Peace again tomorrow, casting the same gentle shadows it always had. But now, when Helen moved between the flower displays, adjusting roses and straightening daisies, everyone who watched understood that they were seeing something remarkable. A master of rescue who had rescued herself, and in doing so, had made her entire community stronger. Some stories end with medals and ceremonies. Others end with quiet understanding, and the simple recognition that service takes many forms. Helen's story was both a decorated soldier who found her greatest mission not in distant battlefields, but in a small flower shop where she could help people bloom. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We'd love to hear what inspired you the most. And where in the world are you watching from? Let us know below.